quiet neighborhood, an unassuming home, and a crime so gruesome it shattered the illusion of safety forever. Welcome to True Crime, the court of public opinion, where we dissect the cases that move through the courts but leave the public endlessly divided. I'm Alexis Knight, your guide through the murky waters of justice, where the facts may be clear, but the truth? That's always up for a debate. Imagine this. You are living in a peaceful suburb where the most exciting news is the occasional bake sale or new family moving in. But then one day, the calm is ripped apart. An elderly couple is found brutally murdered in their home. The killer isn't a stranger or an escaped convict. It's a 15-year-old boy from the same neighborhood. He doesn't seem remorseful. In fact, he seems proud. What would you think? Is he mad or is he bad? That's exactly what happened in Davis, California in 2013. Claudia Maupin and Oliver Northup, a couple in their 70s, they were found stabbed to death in their home. Daniel Marsh, just 15 years old at the time, was arrested for the crime. A troubled teenager with a history of mental health issues, Marshall left the community grappling with a haunting question. Was this an act of a broken mind or pure malice? Stick with me as we dive into this case that forces us to confront the darker corners of the human psyche. Daniel Marsh's story is one that doesn't fit neatly into any box. On one hand, you have a teenager who had battled severe depression and psychiatric hospitalization. And on the other, you have an individual who meticulously planned and carried out a crime so heinous it shocked even seasoned investigators. The trial that followed raised deep questions about the boundaries of mental health defenses, the capacity for rehabilitation, and how society should handle juveniles who commit unspeakable acts. Marsh's calm demeanor during the investigation and the chilling way he described the murders left many asking, can someone so young be so inherently evil? Or was he failed by a system that missed the signs of a dangerous mental illness? Here we're going to explore the layers of this case, from Marsh's background and the horrific details of the crime, to the prosecution's arguments and the defense's plea for understanding. And by the end, you are going to have the chance to decide for yourself. Was Daniel Marsh mad or just bad? And most importantly, was justice truly served? It was April 14th in 2013 when Claudia Maupin, 76, and her husband, Oliver Northup, 87, were found brutally murdered in their home in Davis, California. Each had been stabbed dozens of times, 59 wounds for Claudia, 67 for Oliver. The attack was so vicious that investigators struggled to process the level of rage behind it all. The small, close-knit community was left reeling. Who could commit such a monstrous act against an elderly couple known for their kindness and involvement in local causes? Well, the answer came swiftly, and it was almost as shocking as the crime itself. 15-year-old Daniel Marsh, a high school student who lived only blocks away. The young man confessed in chilling detail, describing how he'd been consumed by violent fantasies for years. He told police how he'd broken into the couple's home in the early hours of the morning, systematically carrying out the murders before slipping back into his life as if nothing ever happened. But even more unsettling than his confession was the way Marsh talked about the crime. He showed no remorse. If anything, he seemed exhilarated. So was this the product of untreated mental illness, as the defense would later argue? Or was Marsh fully aware of his actions, acting out of a calculated, sinister intent? The prosecution painted a chilling picture of a teenager who knew exactly what he was doing and relished every moment of it. The defense, however, they countered with evidence of a long history of psychological instability, claiming Marsh's mental state had spiraled out of control. The trial became a battleground over one question. Could someone so young, with such a troubled mind, truly understand the gravity of their actions? This case forces us to confront the uncomfortable truths. How do we determine if someone is beyond redemption? And at what point does mental illness excuse or fail to excuse unimaginable violence? Let's get into this as we dive deeper into the mind of Daniel Marsh and the events that turned a small California town into the epicenter of a national debate. Okay, well, to understand how Daniel Marsh came to commit such a horrific act, we have to start at the beginning. Marsh was not your average teenager. By the age of 15, he had already been hospitalized for severe depression and had struggled with suicidal thoughts. His parents' divorce had been particularly devastating, leaving him feeling isolated and angry. Teachers and classmates described him as intelligent but deeply troubled, often fixated on violent imagery and dark fantasies. In hindsight, the signs were there, but no one could have predicted what he was capable of, or perhaps no one wanted to. On the night of the murders, Marsh had been wandering the streets, consumed by a desire to kill. He carried a knife, he dressed in black, and targeted the Maupin's home at random. He later admitted that he chose their house simply because it was accessible, and he knew the couple would be easy to overpower. Marsh described breaking in through a sliding glass door and systematically attacking his victims as they slept. His confession to law enforcement was chilling, as he recounted every detail with a calm, almost clinical precision. He even admitted that the act had given him a sense of satisfaction and relief, saying it was something he'd always wanted to do. But here is where the case becomes even more complex. Marsh's defense argued that his actions were not those of a cold-blooded killer, but the result of an untreated mental illness. Experts testified that he had been diagnosed with major depressive disorder and had shown signs of psychopathy, and they claimed that Marsh was disconnected from reality and lacked the ability to fully comprehend the consequences of what he had done. The prosecution, however, painted a very different picture, and they argued that Marsh was fully aware of what he was doing and that he took pleasure in the brutality of his crimes. The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution, but the question remains, was this justice, or did the system fail to account for the complexities of mental illness? What makes this case particularly haunting is the age of the perpetrator. At just 15 years old, Daniel Marsh shattered not only the lives of his victims, but also the sense of security in his community. This was not a crime of passion, it was not a crime of necessity. It was premeditated and methodical, and yet his defense did raise a valid point. How much accountability can we place on someone whose mental state may have been beyond their control? It is a question that continues to divide public opinion to this day. The story of Daniel Marsh begins with a teenager whose life on the surface didn't seem entirely out of the ordinary. He was intelligent, with high academic potential, but those who knew him say there was always something simmering beneath the surface. Marsh's childhood was marked by turmoil. His parents divorced when he was young, and he struggled to cope with the separation. Friends and family noted that Marsh had begun to withdraw, growing increasingly angry and detached. By his early teens, his behavior had become more concerning. He started talking openly about his violent fantasies, which he sometimes drew in graphic detail. Teachers even noticed the shift, but chalked it up to typical teenage angst. It wasn't until he turned 14 that the cracks in his mental health became too big to ignore. In 2012, a year before the murders, Marsh was admitted to a psychiatric facility after expressing suicidal thoughts, and he was diagnosed with major depressive disorder and underwent therapy, but his condition didn't seem to improve. His fascination with violence grew stronger, and he began to idealize serial killers. While his family sought help, Marsh's dark thoughts continued to spiral, and he later told investigators that by the time he was 15, he had developed an overwhelming desire to kill anyone, someone. He said the idea consumed him, making him feel as though he could not resist acting on it. And on the night of April 14th in 2013, he finally acted on those impulses. Dressed in black and armed with a knife, he left his home and wandered the streets of his neighborhood. And when he came across the Maupins' home, he saw an opportunity. He knew they were elderly and likely wouldn't be able to fight back. Marsh broke in through a sliding glass door and immediately went to the couple's bedroom, where he attacked them as they slept. Claudia and Oliver were stabbed repeatedly, suffering nearly 60 wounds each. The attack was brutal, calculated, and merciless. Marsh later admitted that he spent time afterward cleaning the scene and taking steps to avoid leaving any evidence, showing a level of premeditation that would later be key to the prosecution's case. By the time the investigators arrived, the crime scene was unlike anything they'd ever encountered. It was clear this was no ordinary burglary gone wrong. This was something far darker. Marsh would later confess to the murders during a chilling interrogation, but the defense's argument was that his confession was a symptom of his fractured mental state. It would be up to the court to decide whether Daniel Marsh was mad or just bad. When investigators brought Daniel Marsh in for questioning, they were struck by his calm demeanor. Marsh didn't hesitate to confess, detailing the murders with a level of detachment that sent chills through the room. He described how he carefully planned the attack, how he chose his victims at random, and how he felt a sense of relief once the act was done. In a recorded interview, Marsh stated, quote, "I wanted this for a very long time," end quote. He recounted the crime with a clinical precision, even describing how he cleaned his knife and disposed of his clothes afterward. Marsh's words left little doubt that he had acted alone and with intent. What was particularly unsettling was Marsh's description of how he felt after the murders. He told investigators that killing the Maupins brought him a sense of calm, as though it had satisfied a deep and uncontrollable urge. He said he had fantasized about violence for years and felt the carrying out of the murders was inevitable. And while some saw this as evidence of a calculated and remorseless killer, others believed it pointed to severe mental illness. I mean, how could a 15-year-old boy commit such an act and then feel no remorse? As the investigation unfolded, more details about Marsh's life began to surface. His fascination with serial killers, his violent drawings, and his increasingly erratic behavior had all been documented by teachers and counselors and even family members. Yet no one, not one person, had predicted the escalation to murder. Marsh's psychiatric history became a central focus during the trial, with the defense arguing that his mental state had been spiraling out of control, and this had been happening for years. And they claimed he was suffering from psychosis, and that's what made him unable to fully grasp the consequences of what he had done. But the prosecution painted a very different picture, and they argued that Marsh's behavior in the aftermath of the crime, his calm demeanor, his attempts to hide evidence, and his chilling confession showed a level of awareness and intent that could not be ignored. The trial became a clash of perspectives. Was Marsh a young man whose mind was fractured by an untreated mental illness? Or was he a predator who knew exactly what he was doing and simply didn't care about the consequences? As we continue, we're going to dive deeper into the arguments presented by both sides, exploring how this case became a lightning rod for debates about juvenile justice and the intersection of mental health and criminal responsibility. In the days following the murders, the small community of Davis was in shock. The Maupins were well-loved figures, known for their warmth and generosity. Oliver Northup, a retired attorney, had spent decades advocating for the underprivileged, while Claudia was active in local theater and community outreach. Their senseless deaths left friends and neighbors searching for answers, and the revelation that Daniel Marsh, a boy many had seen grown up, was the perpetrator only deepened the disbelief. How could someone so young, someone they knew, commit such an unthinkable act? The evidence against Marsh was overwhelming. His confession alone was enough to convict him, but investigators also found physical evidence linking him to the crime. The knife he used to commit the murders, that was recovered, and forensic testing confirmed the victim's DNA on the blade. Marsh also had kept some of the clothes he wore that night, which further tied him to the scene. Despite his young age, Marsh had taken steps to avoid detection, cleaning up after himself and discarding items he thought might incriminate him. These actions became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, showing that Marsh was aware of what he was doing and understood the need to cover his tracks. But the defense argued that these actions didn't negate Marsh's mental state at the time of the crime. They pointed to his long history of mental health struggles, emphasizing that he had been hospitalized for severe depression and was under psychiatric care in the months leading up to these murders. They also presented expert testimony suggesting that Marsh exhibited signs of psychopathy, a condition that could explain his lack of empathy and remorse. The defense claimed that Marsh's confession, far from proving his guilt, was evidence of his disconnection from reality, and they argued that Marsh's mind was so fractured that he couldn't fully comprehend the horror of what he had done. The jury faced a difficult decision. On one hand, Marsh's actions were undeniably horrific, and his lack of remorse made him seem like a danger to society. But on the other hand, his documented mental health struggles raised questions about his capacity to even understand the consequences of his actions. Ultimately, the jury found Marsh guilty of first-degree murder, rejecting the defense's argument that his mental illness rendered him incapable of forming intent. Marsh was sentenced to 52 years to life in prison, a decision that sparked both relief and outrage within the community. As we explore the arguments presented in court, the question remains: was justice truly served? As the trial continued, more details emerged about Daniel Marsh's state of mind before and after the murders. Prosecutors presented evidence that painted Marsh as a calculating and cold-blooded killer. His online activity, for example, revealed an obsession with violence and death. He frequently visited websites and forums dedicated to serial killers, even watching videos that detailed gruesome crimes. And this, prosecutors argued, showed that Marsh's actions were not the result of an uncontrollable mental illness, but rather the culmination of years of deliberate fantasizing and planning. Adding to this narrative were Marsh's statements to police, which were played for the jury during the trial. In the recordings, Marsh described the murders with a level of detail and detachment that was hard to reconcile with his age. He admitted that he had researched ways to kill more efficiently and had even considered targeting other victims. Marsh's words left the courtroom silent, with many struggling to understand how someone so young could harbor such darkness. To the prosecution, these statements were clear. They were clear proof of Marsh's intent and awareness, and they argued that his actions were not impulsive, but premeditated, warranting the harshest punishment. The defense, however, painted a starkly different picture. Marsh's history of psychiatric treatment was central to their case. They called expert witnesses who testified that Marsh suffered from major depressive disorder and likely had undiagnosed psychopathy. One psychiatrist described Marsh as a ticking time bomb whose mental health had been deteriorating for years, and they argued that his fascination with violence was a symptom of his illness, not a reflection of his character. According to the defense, Marsh was a deeply disturbed teenager who needed treatment, not punishment, and they also highlighted his age, arguing that his brain was still developing and that he might one day be rehabilitated. This clash of perspectives extended beyond the courtroom. The community of Davis was divided, with some calling for Marsh to be tried as an adult and others advocating for leniency due to his age and mental health. The case also reignited debates about the juvenile justice system. Should someone so young be sentenced to decades in prison, or should their potential for rehab be prioritized? Marsh's sentencing, 52 years to life, left many feeling that the legal system had done its job, while others believed it had failed to address the root causes of his actions. The prosecution's case against Daniel Marsh centered on the idea that he was not a victim of his circumstances, but a calculated predator. They argued that Marsh's actions before, during, and after the murders showed a clear understanding of right and wrong. For instance, Marsh meticulously planned the attack, choosing the Maupin's home because he believed the elderly couple would be easy targets. The prosecution emphasized how Marsh took the steps to clean up after the crime, disposing of evidence to avoid detection. And to them, this was proof that Marsh knew his actions were wrong and took deliberate measures to escape accountability. One of the prosecution's most compelling pieces of evidence was Marsh's confession. They played the recording of his entire interview with police, where Marsh described the murders in chilling detail. He spoke with a calm, detached tone, recounting how he had felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction after carrying out the killings. Prosecutors argued that this lack of remorse and his willingness to describe the crime so openly indicated a deep-seated cruelty rather than a fractured mind. They also pointed to Marsh's fascination with serial killers, highlighting his online activity as evidence that he idolized violent figures and sought to emulate them. The prosecution's argument went further, addressing the issue of age. While Marsh was only 15 at the time of the murders, they contended that his actions were those of an adult-level criminal. They described Marsh as a danger to society, someone who had not only committed a heinous crime, but had also expressed a desire to kill again. To the prosecution, the sentencing needed to reflect the severity of his actions. They argued that the justice system could not afford to take a rehabilitative approach in this case, as Marsh's behavior showed no signs of being impulsive or the result of a momentary lapse of judgment. But as strong as the prosecution's case was, the defense presented equally compelling arguments. Marsh's mental health history became the cornerstone of their case, raising the question, could a teenager with such severe psychological issues truly be held to the same standard as an adult? As we'll see in the next section, the defense painted a picture of a young man whose mind was deeply fractured, a victim of his own mental illness rather than a predator acting on cruel intentions. The prosecution's case against Daniel Marsh relied on a clear and chilling narrative. Marsh was not a confused or impulsive teenager, but a calculated and remorseless killer. They argued that every step Marsh took, before, during, and after the murders, demonstrated an awareness of his actions and their consequences. For example, Marsh admitted to choosing the Maupin's home because he believed the elderly couple would be easy to overpower. Prosecutors pointed to how Marsh brought a knife with him, dressed in black, and took deliberate steps to avoid being caught, including cleaning his weapon and disposing of evidence afterward. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was Marsh's recorded confession. In the footage, Marsh described the murders in graphic detail, speaking with a calm, matter-of-fact tone that left no room for doubt about his role in the crime. Prosecutors played this recording for the jury, highlighting the way Marsh described the satisfaction he felt after carrying out the killings. "I've always wanted to do this," is what he said, is what he admitted, explaining how the act brought him a sense of relief. Now, to the prosecution, this was not the behavior of someone struggling with mental illness. This was the calculated work of a predator who knew exactly what he was doing. Another key aspect of the prosecution's argument was Marsh's fascination with violence. They introduced evidence from his online activity, which showed that Marsh frequently visited forums and websites dedicated to serial killers. Prosecutors argued that this was not just idle curiosity, but a sign of a deeper, more dangerous fixation. They also addressed Marsh's age, acknowledging that while he was only 15 at the time, his actions displayed a level of planning and intent more often associated with adult criminals. And to them, Marsh's age did not diminish his responsibility. It underscored the need for a sentence that reflected the gravity of his crimes. Yet while the prosecution's argument painted Marsh as a dangerous and calculating individual, the defense had a different perspective. They presented Marsh's mental health struggles as the key to understanding his actions, arguing that his mind was so fractured that he couldn't fully comprehend the consequences of what he'd done. The defense's case for Daniel Marsh revolved around one central idea. Marsh's actions were not those of a cold-blooded killer, but of a teenager overwhelmed by severe and untreated mental illness. They pointed to his long history of psychiatric struggles, beginning with the diagnosis of major depressive disorder when he was just 14 years old. Marsh had been hospitalized after expressing suicidal thoughts, and his medical records showed a consistent pattern of emotional instability, withdrawal, and violent ideation. According to the defense, these were not the hallmarks of a predator, but the cries for help of a young man whose mental health had spiraled out of control. To strengthen their case, the defense called in expert witnesses who testified about Marsh's psychological state. One psychiatrist described him as suffering from a rare combination of major depression and psychopathy, a condition that can lead to a profound disconnect between actions and emotions. And this expert argued that Marsh's fascination with violence, it was not a choice, it was a symptom of his illness. They also pointed to Marsh's age, emphasizing that the teenage brain is still developing and that his actions, while horrific, were the product of a mind incapable of fully understanding the consequences of his behavior. The defense also highlighted the moments of vulnerability in Marsh's life that they argued contributed to his mental state. His parents' divorce had left him feeling abandoned, and his attempts to connect with peers had largely failed, leaving him isolated. Marsh's growing obsession with violent fantasies, they claimed, was a way of coping with feelings of powerlessness and despair. And they argued that this, combined with his untreated mental health issues, created a perfect storm that culminated in the murders of Claudia and Oliver. But the defense's arguments were not without their critics. The prosecution countered that while Marsh's mental health history was undeniable, it didn't absolve him of responsibility. They argued that Marsh's actions, such as cleaning the scene and lying to avoid detection, showed a level of awareness and intent that could not be ignored. The jury faced a daunting challenge, balancing the severity of Marsh's crime against the reality of his mental health struggles. As the trial continued, the jury was presented with a stark choice. Was Daniel Marsh fully aware of his actions, or was his mind so fractured that he could not grasp the severity of what he had done? The prosecution maintained their position, emphasizing Marsh's deliberate actions before and after the murders. They pointed out how he had scoped out the Maupin's home, ensuring there was an accessible entry point and confirming their vulnerability as elderly residents. This level of planning, they argued, was inconsistent with someone acting impulsively or without understanding the consequences of their actions. The prosecution also returned to Marsh's chilling confession, replaying portions of his police interview to remind the jury of his lack of remorse. They highlighted the moments where Marsh described the murders as exciting and admitted that he felt a sense of satisfaction afterward. This, they claimed, was not the behavior of someone disconnected from reality. Instead, it was evidence of a calculated individual who understood the gravity of his actions and simply didn't care. They asked the jury to consider the broader implications. Could someone like Marsh ever be rehabilitated? Or would leniency risk endangering others in the future? Meanwhile, the defense sought to humanize Marsh, portraying him as a deeply troubled teenager who had been failed by the systems that were meant to protect him. And they argued that his fascination with violence was a manifestation of his mental illness, not a reflection of his character. Marsh's psychiatric history became a focal point, with the defense pointing to his repeated hospitalizations and ongoing therapy as evidence of his fragile mental state. They also presented testimony from friends and family who described a boy who was once kind and loving, but who had become increasingly withdrawn and angry over time. To further their case, the defense called attention to Marsh's age. They argued that his brain was still developing, making him more impulsive and less capable of controlling his actions than an adult. This, combined with his mental health struggles, should be taken into account when determining his punishment. The defense argued the jury should see Marsh not as a monster, but as a victim of his circumstances, a young man who needed treatment, not lifelong imprisonment. The closing arguments from both sides set the stage for a decision that would continue to spark debate long after this trial ended. Could Daniel Marsh truly be rehabilitated, or was he beyond saving? The closing statements from both sides left the jury with a daunting decision. The prosecution argued that Marsh's calculated behavior and lack of remorse proved he was a danger to society and beyond rehabilitation. They asked the jury to consider the horrific nature of the crime and the clear premeditation involved, insisting that Marsh should face the full weight of the law. On the other hand, the defense pleaded for compassion, pointing to his age and mental health struggles as mitigating factors. They argued that Marsh's actions, while they were horrific, they were the result of a broken mind, not pure malice. In the end, the jury sided with the prosecution, finding Marsh guilty of first-degree murder and sentencing him to 52 years to life. For some, this decision represented justice, a necessary punishment for an unspeakable crime. For others, it felt like a failure to address the root causes of Marsh's behavior, a missed opportunity to prioritize treatment over punishment. The community of Davis was left grappling with questions that have no easy answers. How do we balance accountability with compassion? The never-ending question. And can someone so young with such deep psychological issues ever be fully understood? And now I turn it over to you. Can you commit to mad or bad in this case? It's a tough question, and that's why we talk about cases like this. Thank you for joining me in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there, ask the difficult questions, and always dig for the truth. Until next time, this is Alexis Knight.